Welcome to EdTech Examined, a series about educational technology and what you need to know. I'm Erik Christiansen.
And I'm Kris Hoang.
Well, welcome to another episode of EdTech Examined. How's it going today, Kris?
It's going well. We made it to number 50.
Yeah, like Freedom 50. That's like Freedom 55.
55.
And we're retired. 50 is where it ends. No, I'm just joking. We hit 50 episodes. We were told early on that podcasts only last on average to 12 or 13. Yeah. And we showed those people. Yeah, not that we were trying to compete. Though it's interesting that we've hit the 50th episode and we have so little to talk about.
Well, I'm sure we'll come up with enough. But yeah, it has been a little bit delayed. I don't know where the time goes. It's already October. We were just messaging last week thinking, we should probably get an episode out. But
yeah, occasionally you and I have. So for Inside Baseball, if anyone's interested in the world of podcasting, Kris and I used to, we would have a template in Google Docs that we called the rundown, and we would copy that once a month because this isn't like monthly, but we do a mid-month when we can. And then we would include all the links to the articles and stuff like that. But the problem is that it's a lot of work to constantly create that. So we're always trying to think of ways to reduce friction. So now for articles, if you send me something or if I find something, I just put it in Pinboard, which is the bookmarking app that I use. And I just tag it with podcast topic. And there's a link that Kris and I can see all the articles. And we just hope that the other person has looked at it before we start, and then we just run with it. I mean, it's a lot easier. In some ways, it's better because we're not working with a second document. We just have to open the links, right?
Yeah, for sure. We're trying to streamline, become more efficient.
Well, and I would take notes and I would put them in, and then I would never read them in the Google Doc. And I was like, this is kind of a waste of time. We also, this way we can, when we pick tips and tech stuff, rather than put it in the document, sometimes we just come out with things and the other person has no idea, which kind of makes it more interesting. We can surprise the other person with tech tips or ironic musings and observations, because they're not all documented. We don't have to follow a script. It sounds improvised, which is the whole goal.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, no, I'm pleasantly surprised that we made it. And it's a nice, I mean, at the end of it, it's actually recently somebody asked me if there's anything that I need to promote. And I was kind of racking my brain and thinking, I mean, the only thing would be, I guess, maybe the podcast. And even that, I mean, it's not like we're doing it for publicity's sake.
Or money.
Well, who knows? Maybe one day.
Maybe one day.
Really, if we look back and reflect on it, the whole reason was with the pandemic and, just trying to help people out, cope with things. And, it's become a nice little side hobby for us, and working on our kind of audio editing and other skills.
So we do have a Patreon now for our podcast.
Has anybody giving us money?
No, and I haven't promoted it. So this is the problem. So for folks who do like to listen to this fine podcast, we'll put it it's on our website, but you're always welcome to support us at patreon.com/edtechexamined. So if you want to be the first patron, and at this point, we're just trying to get the ball rolling. I just finished updating that site, so it's like workable. But please consider supporting this fine podcast. But with that, I suppose we should go into. Did you have anything else to say about our 50 years together? I'm just joking.
50 years. No, I think let's just keep going for the next 50. Let's see how it goes.
Yes, to 100 is a good goal. We did have a pretty good. I thought the book launch went well. What did you think?
Yeah, I think so. I haven't had a chance. I actually had some pictures taken and stuff. I haven't even had time to go and share it on social media. So maybe I'll do a throwback or something. But yeah, I mean, it was pretty well attended, a nice mix of people from different disciplines. I'm really happy with how U of C, created as an open resource for people. So, um, hopefully we'll be able to keep the momentum going, and hopefully even just having that, the best of both worlds, both online and in person. I mean, even right before we started, I was mentioning this, that there are some things that I've carried over from online delivery into the in-person, although I think sometimes some students, for whatever reason, they decide to maybe overlook or some of the accommodations that we're doing that way. So, but ultimately, I'm hoping for a better experience for learning wise.
Yeah, I agree. I'm trying to bring as much um, into the classroom. Some of the tools do work really well face to face. They're not exclusive to online, though they work well in online learning. So that's the case. I'm also going to do another shameless plug. If you like what Kris and I have talked about, you should go purchase a copy of the University of Calgary's Press's excellent book, Voices from the Digital Classroom. I haven't counted the number of pages of our chapter, but I suspect it's one of the longer ones at the very least. So Kris and I talk about this project, what we think of where higher education and distance learning is going in general.
Yeah, for sure.
So I suppose we can move on to our tech tip, our EdTech office hours, which encompasses now all our tech tips. So I had very little prepared for today. Part of the reason is that I haven't had a lot of time lately to explore new tools. Both of us have been super busy. It's really that late September, early October where things really get down to crunch. So I'm sure we'll have come across new tools and tips and stuff, as we get back and looking at the tech blogs and things like that. But I did want to bring up something that has come up in one of my classes and some of the instruction that I've been doing. So I had a student ask me, because we were working with Google Docs, we were working with a variety of tools. I talked about the importance of organization, digital organization, keeping your digital house in order, so to speak. And a student I just said, is there any final questions about anything? I leave it really open-ended. And the student said, if you were to say there's, a skill that is really valuable that I should master, like a digital skill that I could use in the workforce, like that's organizational related, what would it be? It was much more eloquently put than the way I said, but that was basically the question. And I thought about it for a second, and I said, you can learn all the tools, you can find YouTube videos, you can find all these best practices with whatever you want to do. But the number one thing for keeping your own house in order, and also that companies care about, particularly if you work in any big organization, is really sticking to a file naming convention. And I think the student was a little bit surprised because it's so old school, right? It's such an old school way of thinking about management. Why would we bother to organize our files? We have Google Drive, we can rely on search, stuff like that. But when I look back through the files on my computer, and I look back through all the things I have, if I go to my Mac here and I go to my documents, all my files are named more or less. There's some exceptions in a very similar way. And I don't think you have to use a particular standard. It can be a standard of your own design. So for instance, I either start files with the date that they were created or the title. And I start them with title or date, depending on how they need to be organized. So for instance, my blog articles, I save them as text documents and archive them, even though they're published online. I always put them date first, because that's probably how I'm going to browse them in that folder. But other documents, I'm never going to organize them by date. That's not how I would look for them. So I save and digitize a lot of receipts and stuff like that for things that I may need to return. I need to back up warranties, whatever. So I organize those by title, and the date comes, kind of closer to the end of the file. Between all words, I use dashes, and between all concepts, so it would be like title, dashes between all the words in the title, and then underscore where I bought the item, underscore date, or something like that. Underscores kind of between different sections. And so that's my own system. You don't have to follow what I do. Some people just use dashes for everything. It doesn't matter. Or some people use camel case. So they capitalize where they start and then they go lowercase for everything else, or capitalize every word, the first letter of every word, so they can read it. And of course, there's limitations onto how many characters you can put in a file name, which is something to consider depending. I don't know. I think it's probably different depending on the platform. It's fairly very simple. But all this being said, the reason I brought that up is that it's something that I'd strongly recommend some mastery over, that I think would be well served in the workforce. And I did some light browsing online and came across a Medium article that somebody had written. So the benefits of efficient file naming protocol, right? And so it's useful for not only finding your own files where they are, you're organizing it in a way that makes sense to you. Other people can then read your files. That's really important. Really important if you're a student. Sending Google Docs to your instructor that are called untitled is not very helpful. So, that can result in not good grades. It's helpful for tracking revisions. So sometimes under documents, I'll put V1, and then if I've edited it, especially if it's Microsoft Word and I don't have like a revision system like Google Docs, then I can put version 2, or I'll save another copy that's version 2. I do that with papers like studies that I'm working on for publication, like academic work. And so there's a few things to consider for file names. The Medium article that I just found to kind of back up my supposition here basically talks about an organization identification if necessary, an author, have a category if that's helpful to you, have a subject, draft or a version number, status designation such as it in progress, or is this the final copy, or completed, or something like that. And so you can do whatever works for you, but I'll end here by just saying that a file naming system is probably good for you, and it'll probably be really helpful for your employer. I've always been organized that way. I like doing that stuff. So it's easy for me to say, right? It's in my nature. You don't become a librarian if you don't like things to be in order. That would be an error. But it has helped me because all my files, typically, I like to think, make sense to everybody else.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, Erik, it's a good point because we take it a little bit for granted. I don't know about from your side, but I mean, I remember taking a course during high school where we were introduced to Windows 3.0. So, I mean, I'm probably dating you a little bit, but
I remember Windows 3.0.
Oh, there you go. So, and then, I remember going through and learning how to go and create file names. And back then, the convention was that we would go and put underscores because it would not recognize the spaces in between. So that's what we were, told was the best practice. And so I've kind of stuck to that. Although recently I've noticed, I still do that, but like when we're uploading files, I don't know if it's the easiest for people. So, sometimes when I upload files for our learning management system, I've actually now recently just started removing the underscores and just putting the actual, whatever it is, let's say if it's an assignment. So just put all the words together, and so it makes sense hopefully and for the students. But yeah, I mean, I always, typically my approach is I start with the date, and I don't know from your side what you do with the date, but I usually do it with the year, 2 digits, then I go into month, and then I go into day, and then I'll go underscore whatever it is. And
I do year, month, day. I do 4 digits for the year.
Yeah, so I just do 2 because the chances of us living 1,000 years probably isn't going to be a big deal. But yeah, I mean, I think it is good and important. As much as a lot of people, they rely on the search, and I've I've seen this. Maybe Google is maybe a little bit better given they are a search engine, but sometimes finding things in Microsoft, especially on Outlook, it's difficult. It's sometimes you don't see if you can't find it. I've actually noticed it's interesting searching on the desk, like on your computer using the web browser versus searching your phone. There's sometimes differences as well, and so yeah, it's not 100%. And so again, I think it is important for people to figure out whatever that naming convention is and keep things organized. And especially if you are writing something that is, let's say if it is, I don't know, maybe some major paper, probably a good idea to see the different versions. And that's why I don't even know if I would necessarily need like the version number, because I usually just create a new version based on the date, and then I can go track back.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say that people can keep this flexible too, right? Like I said, like you asked me if I do date first. Sometimes, if it's items in a folder that I would organize by date, the rule is just that everything has dashes between the words or numbers, and then there's an underscore when I come to a new section of the naming. That's it. I do start with dates if it's useful for me to browse the files by date, but like I don't use dates as the starting point for, let's say, the outlines that I've done for my classes and all the documents, because I need to organize them by, is it psychology 2285? Is it psychology 2235? Is it HPED 2507? So they need to be alphabetized by the course title, and that the date is in there. And it comes later. I've probably violated my own system at some point. Like I'm sure I could go through and find, like sometimes I don't have a date at all, because it's not something that I created. Like it's like a title of a recipe, right? So okay. I have harissa roast chicken.pdf. That's good enough. I don't need to have there is no author for this recipe. It's not my recipe. I photographed it out of a magazine. I don't even know what the date was. It doesn't really matter, right? If I have, sure. I kind of treat it like a citation. Like if you don't have a volume or issue or a page range, you don't include it in the citation. And it's kind of the same thing for mine. Again, I'm not trying to cite stuff. I'm just trying to go back and find it. But anyways, whatever works for folks, that's relatively consistent, is the right solution. And I only bring it up because, I don't get to talk about it that much. It's not really relevant to what I do in the classroom, but people probably see it because the documents I send out are all kind of named that way. So it doesn't surprise me now that I think of it that I was asked that question.
Yeah. Well, and again, I mean, it's like I've seen this personally. So for one of the courses I teach, we're in the computer lab, and for whatever reason, I have to keep reminding students they don't even save the file. And right. I've had this happen so far in the last 6 years. So, students are writing a test, and 2 times this has happened where Word crashed and they lost all the work that they're working on for their test. And, luckily I didn't have anything else happening afterwards. So I just stayed longer and accommodated the student. But, that should be the first thing, is just make sure that you save your information. And I mean, imagine, I've even seen situations where people are working on their PhD thesis or master thesis, and they lose their thumb drive or their laptop gets stolen or whatever. And I mean, that would be a big problem. And that's where, I mean, we've talked about it in the past about just having backups and redundancies.
Yeah, so back up your stuff all the time. And I'm trying to remember what episode title. We did a episode where we discussed backing things up. It may have even been in number 9, capture, configure, control. The most downloaded episode, I may add, where we did have a section on data backup and some of the ways that you can do that. I think we've covered it in a couple of episodes, but I can link back to that. But it's a good strategy.
Yeah, absolutely.
We did have some, I guess, a little bit of news. I guess our hardware recommendations / keep an eye out for future updates section. We're diverging a bit here from our episode order conventions because of the lack of information. One of the things we didn't do this year is do a dedicated back to school recommended tech and equipment episode. In fact, I'd point you to our 2021 back to school episode because it's largely unchanged.
Yeah.
There's not a huge amount. There is an article that we can put in. There's an updated article from the Wirecutter, which is a great aggregator of reviews. Best laptops for college students, which is kind of interesting. And so they pick a variety of Windows computers, Asus, HP Spectre, usually on the more affordable side. And of course, they recommend the MacBook Air, the 2020 version. So we didn't have a huge recommendations list for students. Apple did come out with some new hardware, which we want to, and in an event which we want to talk about recently, but that wasn't laptops. So I guess what I would say to students is, find a relatively new MacBook Air or Windows Ultrabook, and try to find the best deal on either the current version or even the most recent previous version.
Yeah, it was interesting. So this was updated October 3rd, but from the Apple side, they were recommending that 2020 MacBook Air. And you were even mentioning recently that you purchased one for your wife. And, again, it's one of those things that if you really look at it spec wise, I mean, cost wise, it probably will take care of most, student needs and maybe even beyond that.
You'd be better off with the M1 MacBook Air as a laptop with 16 gigs of RAM over the M2, the newer version with 8, in my opinion. Just from a multitasking, you want it to last the lifespan of your university career or most of it. In terms of laptops, there's always something to consider. I want to talk a little bit later about Microsoft because there's some really good devices from Microsoft. But, Dell, the XPS 13, a lot of these recommendations are more or less the same. So we're not doing, I guess, this is more of a public service. We're not doing a breakdown this year because most of the recommendations are the same model with a minor update is what we would recommend from our previous episode. It is interesting to me, though, to watch what people have in the classroom. Overwhelmingly MacBook Airs or Windows Ultrabooks, which is not surprising. A large number of students have a desktop or a laptop at home, and they bring an iPad to class and they use it with a keyboard. I would say, so here's an interesting piece of history, or I think it's interesting. So when I was in graduate school in 2011, 2012, I had an iPad that I had with a Bluetooth keyboard and a case, and I took all my notes in Evernote at the time, and I used that. And people thought that was insane. Now, this is a long time ago, so there was no there wasn't a lot going on the iPad. You could use one thing at a time, but I thought it was great. You had really great battery life. The battery life on laptops, you didn't have 15 hours back then. So this had fantastic battery life. It was light. We had our own computer lab when I was in grad school with, all brand new iMacs and Windows computers. So there was no need for me to bring a laptop because I would just go log into Google Drive. It was a University of Alberta is a Google school, and I would do everything there in the lab, and then I would go home and I had all my stuff there. So I needed something to work on, to take to a coffee shop or to take to class. And then my colleagues and I who were doing a project together would always end up in the lab anyways. But I notice a lot. I would say, between 10 and mostly iPad, though there's also Windows and Android too.
Yeah, I mean, on my side, I would say there's probably maybe a handful of people that are bringing in the tablets, but I do think, like, from what I've seen, the ones that are using it, again, from a memory retention standpoint, I mean, using that stylus probably is going to help. I mean, there is a huge number of students that bring in their laptops, but I don't know if it's like almost like just bringing it for the sake of bringing it. They're not even typing much or taking notes. So
yeah, they have it so they can. So that's another option. If you have a really good computer at home, I know a lot of students have told me they bought a desktop Maybe they game on it and they do homework. Totally understandable, right? Why would you have multiple devices? So I need something inexpensive I can bring to class. And the iPad is the entry level is more than sufficient. I'm not very expensive. So I think I'm going to go back on my previous year's words and say, if you have a computer already that's maybe not new, that's good enough. An iPad, particularly for the class, is not, even if you'd have no other Apple devices, that doesn't really matter. There's all sorts of apps that cross-platform. It's a really, really good device. I think you can probably get away with it at this point.
Yeah,
I use mine all the time. The one that Kris and I both have, I take it to class. I have a keyboard for it. I have a mouse for it. It works great. I rarely need to use a real computer for day-to-day stuff. It's actually remarkable. So I bring it up because I see it all the time in class. It's amazing to me how things have changed.
Yeah.
It really has.
Actually, interesting enough, you mentioned like the mouse. First time I've seen this semester, but there was a student who actually brought a wired mouse for the laptop.
Wow.
Yeah. So I mean, and I asked that student, why did you do that? And she just mentioned that it's easier for her wrist and just to go and navigate things as opposed to looking at the trackpad, which kind of makes sense. And I think probably, especially, it would be maybe even that much easier if it was a Bluetooth mouse, right?
I like plugging in a wired mouse. I should do that. I should bring in my vertical ergonomic volume mouse and plug it into the computer and go in there. That's pretty epic. We did have, so this does go into some hardware stuff that's useful. So maybe we can talk briefly, Kris, about what Apple talked about last month. We didn't cover it because we were focused on promoting the book chapter. Our last episode, we re-released our interview from 2020 with the Teaching and Learning Online Network. We do re-release content, particularly for the mid-month episodes, because, well, it's still relevant and it just sits there and it gets forgotten about. So that's what we're doing. But Apple did have an announcement earlier in September, so it's about a month ago now, but I think it's still worth talking about, especially that now we can digest it, where they did introduce laptops or iPads. I think that'll happen this month, and we'll cover that. If they do, we promise we'll touch on it, but that's relevant for education. But they did introduce new iPhones, iPhone 14 and 14 Pro, AirPods, and Apple Watch. So maybe we start with the watch.
Yeah, I mean, this on the watch side, I was telling you earlier, I mean, if I had to go and get the watch and if that was my only device, I probably would go for that Apple Watch Ultra.
The sports watch, the extreme watch for outdoor enthusiasts.
Yeah. But I mean, it's like you were saying, Erik, like that's what the Apple Watch should have been right from the get-go. It's much more durable. The battery life is there, right? Yeah. Because it is a bigger watch. It just looks kind of substantive. I like their new kind of sports kind of related watch straps that they have, depending on what you're into. So if it's water sports or if you're going into like, extreme winter kind of hiking or what have you, they have a different one for that. So yeah, I mean, it looks pretty sweet. But I guess the price is pretty sweet too.
It's expensive. I think it's over $1,000 Canadian to start. So it's a luxury item for sure, and probably something from an education perspective that's probably a little bit of out of reach. I thought so. One of the things I find interesting about the watch and why I think it's interesting to education is that one of my criticisms of education for a long time, and not education's fault, but that there's so much sitting. Right? You're sitting doing homework, you're sitting through class. I think I gained like weight probably the first time I did undergraduate. And it's just tough, right? Especially the first year or two, you're learning a lot. So I like the idea of something that reminds people to stand up, reminds people to take a break and stuff like that. What I was most surprised about, I've never owned one of these devices because it's, even for me as an academic, I just find it to be too expensive. I have a bunch of nice watches, but I typically wear a Timex watch every day. That was $80. So it's not very expensive. But the Apple Watch SE, which is
Mhm.
their, I guess SE stands for special edition, I was told.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, and that one starts at 329. So it's still expensive for students. $100, $50 is money that students need. But I believe it's the same innards chip as the newest Series 8. It doesn't have
Oh,
an older
really?
processor. I think it's more or less the same. So if the Apple Watch Ultra is supposed to be able to withstand like extreme conditions, like mountain climbing, Everest, stuff like this. So like if you don't
Yeah.
need that, and you just need a fitness device that's like a health thing, while you're a student or as an academic, I think the SE is probably the way to go. I know that there is the regular Apple Watch,
So
Series 8. Series
yeah.
8 is what they're on now. And I think even that still starts at over $500, like 529. So you get a smaller screen with the other one. It's probably not as water resistant. But the SE seems more than capable.
Yeah. And again, like, I mean, if money was no object, like I just look at it, the fact that it is bigger, like that Ultra, but the it's also made out of titanium, so it's much more resistant. Like whereas the regular watches, they're made out of aluminum. If you get the cellular ones, those ones are made out of steel,
Are
so
they
they're a little
still?
bit.
Maybe they
I
are.
thought they were. I don't know about the latest ones, but typically that was one of the differences that you would have, is that you would have a better case for it. And I guess this Ultra has a sapphire display, so that it's much more resistant as well. I mean, I've actually noticed. So I have the Series 5, and recently I've just noticed that there's a couple of scratches on my screen. I mean, they're like superficial, but I don't know. I like to have my stuff pretty pristine, so it's kind of bugging me. I might have to go and get a new one just because of that.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting stuff. Apple did announce new phones. I think a phone is like an appendage at this point, so it's probably useful. So if you're on the upgrade cycle for a phone, academic or student, I mean, it's just something that everybody has to have. It's like their wallet, it's their public transit pass now, amazingly. At least it is in the city of Calgary. I'm sure it is in other places. So Apple introduced the 14 and 14 Plus, and then the 14 Pro and Pro
Yeah,
Max. These are terrible naming conventions. And I think the 14 is a total skip from what I can tell. It is absolutely very minor upgrade from the previous generation. It doesn't even change the innards whatsoever. It's only the Pro model that really
yeah.
made any design differences, chip, better camera. But again, for our audience, it's probably overkill and too expensive. And I would wait for those features to come into the next entry level.
And I think the big difference, actually, it was funny. I had a student just yesterday ask, so I have the 13 Pro, and they're like, "Oh, did you get the 14?" And I'm like, "No, I haven't yet." And in fact, actually, one student didn't even realize that Apple's come out with a new version, and I think that the particular student had a iPhone 10. But it's funny because even the students, when we were looking at it, I don't think they can tell much for a difference. I think the only major kind of design change is that just at the top, that notch.
Well, it's not a
So
notch, it's the dynamic island.
yeah, exactly.
So, does that mean I was listening to a podcast? So, that for the folks that are interesting, Apple has that notch, the cutout. And so they got rid of the cutout and it's more like a hole punch. That's a kind of design, but they've leaned into it. So it expands and contracts, or the black bezel around it shows notifications. So to make it look less like a hole punch, they've kind of leaned into it as a design element. They call it the dynamic island. But though I was listening to another podcast and they said, well, what do we call the old one? The notch, because the notch never had a cool name. So I think it was Jason Snell. He's a long time. He used to be the editor in chief of MacWorld when it was in print. He said it should be called the Static Peninsula. So there's the minor design changes. Again, I think Apple hasn't really come out with the education-y stuff At this point, they're sticking, this is more like their consumer phones and watches. I guess they have the AirPods, which they updated, the pro versions at least, but there's nothing here that's iPad or Mac that would impact, people's computer purchases.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, the only thing, like as our buddy Scott Galloway kind of says, it's basically you're signifying to the opposite sex that you have something of value. It's almost akin to like a Rolex or something. And I don't
Yeah,
know,
it
or at
is.
least that's what some people think. I don't know how much the opposite sex actually looks at these devices and notices, but I guess it is a signifier of luxury and prestige.
Well, it's certainly become a signifier of wealth and prestige, which is interesting to me because I remember cell phones, particularly smartphones, when they first came out. I don't know if people of my ilk will remember this, was kind of laughed at as like, why would you need that? Even when cell phones came out, there was kind of like, why would you need to be in contact all the time? Just go home and use the phone. So they started out as these really geeky things. Laptops are the same thing. Tablets. I remember tablets when they ran Windows XP. I mean, so this was nerd stuff, basically. And now it's become mainstream technology. And having the latest and greatest high end electronics or computing has really become somewhat of a status symbol. I think those who are able to look through that can largely ignore it by the previous generation at this point. Is it really going to make a difference, right? I use a 2017 iPhone. That doesn't matter to text people and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, but not to be left out. We talk about Apple, but I do try to make sure that we cover the Windows side. So there is some interesting news or rumors coming out. So this month, so October 12th, I believe it's 10 a.m. Eastern time, Microsoft, which makes hardware, is going to have an event. And it's expected that it's going to be one of their Surface events. Microsoft makes a line of computers called Surface. So they have a Surface laptop, which is a touchscreen laptop. They have the Surface Pro, which is the tablet with the kickstand and the detachable keyboard. They have the Surface Studio, which is a touchscreen desktop that works as like a drawing easel. And then they have another thing, the Surface something that's like a drawing easel laptop. And so there's some rumors floating around about new Microsoft hardware. And we'll put a link from Windows Central, which did a good job covering it, because this is just a few days old, this article. But this is useful to folks who prefer to work in the Windows ecosystem, particularly Windows 11, which we'll talk about. There are some recent updates to Windows that are useful for productivity. And so it looks like there's going to be new devices coming down the pike. So a new Surface Laptop 5, I think the current generation must be 4, a new Surface Pro 9, Surface Studio 3. That hasn't been updated for some time. Yeah. So that's kind of what we're expecting to be updated for educators and students. When I do see a lot of Surface laptops, so that's a regular clamshell laptop.
Yeah.
And I also see a lot of Surface Pros, the Surface Pro being with the kickstand and stuff. So I think it's likely that we'll see some pretty significant upgrades to the processors, particularly there's the next generation of Intel processors. And, Intel, being the big chip maker, has done some really great work and has, in many respects, really caught up to what Apple has done. Intel was supposed to be down and out a few years ago, and now they're just guns blazing. So they have some really great hardware, much better battery life, really comparable performance to what Apple's putting out. I think, Apple stuff is great. I use a Mac, but I really find the Windows ecosystem and all the updates that Microsoft has done. I mean, I have to hand it to them that they were laughed at about 10 years ago when they entered the hardware space, and they're coming out with some really cool stuff now. And so this is a really great option for people who are like, I don't really use a Mac. I don't want to learn that. There's some great Windows devices for Microsoft that are probably going to come down the pike. I mean, I don't have reviews. These are rumors of what's to be announced.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, there's also the rumor that this month we're going to see new laptops and iPads from Apple as well. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, because if you look at it, especially this year, like the last couple of years, they've been giving the free AirPods. And so this year they gave a $200 or up to $200 and something kind of gift certificate, depending on what you buy. And, so obviously they want to go and clear out their old stock. I think one of the big surprises too that people with the Apple event was that the prices didn't increase for the iPhones.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, going back, if you look at it, one of the things that they've done, I think probably from a business standpoint, I mean, they have the margin, so they can go and keep the price still pretty consistent. Plus, what they've done is they've diversified their manufacturing. So now about half of it is being done in China, and then the other half is being produced in India. So then they won't have those kind of supply chain issues. On an interesting note, actually, a student was telling me last night there was apparently the premium space in retail now. It used to be eye level, right? And so now apparently it is an eye level. And the reason for that is everybody is walking around with their smartphones. And so they're kind of crouched down. And so I guess it's the stuff that's below eye level is now the premium kind of retail slots that if you want to go and push your products.
So what you're telling me is that when I print off Follow EdTech Examined cards with a link to our website, I should put it over top of the price tags at like the kind of the lower 30%.
Yeah, exactly.
I got it. I'll do that. I've been putting it in all the wrong places. I was thinking eye level, right?
There you go.
So there's a few hardware announcements coming. We'll cover that. Maybe what we'll do once there's more announcements from the Windows and Mac side, we can do a bit of a comparison in terms of value. One of the things that's really confusing for people is that, especially on the Windows side, it gets worse. But on the Mac side too, there are so many configurations for these machines that I think maybe what we'll do, Kris, is after this month is through, we'll take a look at what Microsoft has to offer, what Apple has to offer, and we'll come up with a recommended configuration best value for their newest stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
How much RAM, how much storage do you need? What's the best price? Do you go with the older model? Do you look at refurbished? And do the same thing for Windows, because I think that might be helpful. So if you are in the market for a device, don't purchase it today. Hold off. If you just bought it, return it and wait. I'm not even joking. That's what I would do. Return it and wait and see what comes up, because there should be some good stuff now that the back to school sales have passed.
Unless you absolutely need it. So.
If you absolutely need it, that's fair. But if you can absolutely need it and wait 2 weeks and use the computers at your university, that would be well advised. It's funny that the library at MacWorld, we have a great computer lab, but sometimes it's very empty, and I'm quite surprised because we have really nice Windows 11 desktops running through there. But that's actually probably a good segue. There is a couple of relevant education updates to Windows. I don't think we typically do Windows updates. Nobody talks about Windows updates. It's so banal. It's so boring. But there was a couple things that are happening. So a lot of computers that are newer are going to start getting the option to be updated to Windows 11. So if you have Windows 10, I have Windows 10 at work. Windows 10 is fine. You don't need to worry about it right now. But newer processors within the last few years, there's some hardware requirements, are going to be given the option to upgrade to Windows 11. I like Windows 11. I think it's fine. It's a worthy update to Windows 10. It seems to work. It's equally performant. But if you are on Windows 11, there's a few tools that might be useful to you, particularly in the productivity space. So one of the things that Windows is known for is, windowing applications. That's where it came from. I've always found it way easier out of the box to put windows side by side, to put 4 windows. In fact, I was talking to a student today. I went over to his laptop, and there was a window in each quadrant of his laptop screen. Like he had, and minimized it. And he had this like command center display. I was super impressed. But it's way easier to snap windows to particular sections and quadrants of the screen, which I have always appreciated. With Apple, I do that, but I have to have a third-party tool. And so they're going to make that easier. In Windows now, when you go to drag a window to say half of the screen, a little pane is going to pop up and it's going to show you kind of where you can snap the window to. So it's a little, you don't have to do it through discovery. It kind of guides you along the process. I think that's actually really valuable because a lot of that window snapping and stuff is kind of hidden at this point. There's also going to be a couple of ways to minimize distractions, which I think is good. So Windows is actually ahead of the game when it came to do not disturb over the Apple stuff. Apple calls the stuff on their platform focus mode, where you can kind of determine what apps can send you notifications and when, during what times, or if you're at a particular location. So as an example, I have it set up to all the Apple devices I have go into focus mode when I go into the geographic location that is my work. There's like a geofence set up. Windows, you can do similar types of focus mode. They're calling it focus mode now, and a do not disturb mode that you can minimize distractions. So this is an article from CDNet or CNET. So according to Microsoft, when you start a new focus session, Windows automatically turns on do not disturb. So that's a plus. You won't get bugged with notifications. This silences notifications, turns off taskbar badges, so like the little notification numbers above the icon, and app notifications that are in the taskbar. Focus also improves the clock app with timers to help you focus and remember to take breaks. So I think you can even use it like a Pomodoro, where it will go off every so often to take a break. And that'll be built into Windows now, which is a super cool feature. There's also some accessibility features being brought to Windows. So Narrator, so that's Windows 11's built-in screen reader, is getting I've actually heard from some samples, it's getting a natural sounding voice rather than like the robot text-to-speech voice that we're used to. And it's a huge improvement. So if you use a screen reader for low vision or just in general, I've used screen readers and some of the voiceover navigation in general. I find it helpful. If you're doing that, then it'll sound better. And there's also a system-wide live captions, which is pretty cool. So we'll go beyond individual apps as live caption features. So system-wide live captions will display at the top of the screen and under the camera by default. But then, of course, you can switch up where those captions take place. So you can have a screen reader. It'll be captioned of what it's saying. You can capture microphone audio live captions for transcribing in-person conversations. So there's a bunch of these voice access features in addition to productivity stuff that's coming to Windows, which is pretty exciting. I think that's very helpful. I'm always on the lookout for accessibility.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. I read something recently that the younger generation these days, when they're watching, let's say, Netflix or what have you, they actually turn on the closed captioning. And one of the reasons why they do that is so that they don't miss out on anything.
Yeah. I mean, I'm used to watching movies with my dad, who's older, so he can't hear as well. So he puts on the captions for that reason. But even movies that are in English where they have a heavier accent. I was watching a movie, it was an Indian movie that they were speaking English, but it was a heavier accent. So there was things that I was missing. Even British movies, British, I can understand the accent, but they say stuff. They have slang. I have no idea what it means. And I have to be like, is that what they really said? So then it shows it on captions.
Yeah.
And I can see how it's spelled. Right. And so it is helpful. And captions look better now. I mean, you can often adjust the size where they are. It used to be just awful big green captions. That's not the case anymore. So I think those accessibility features are helpful to everybody at a certain level.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's, I think, pretty much all we had to talk about. Is there anything you wanted to to bring up on our 50th episode?
I don't know if there's anything else. We've covered it. Looking forward to continuing working on this, and we'll see how far we go.
Yeah, absolutely. Just as a reminder to folks who are listening, so you can find out more about this podcast. You can follow us at edtechexamine.com. That's the website. We have links to all of the platforms that our fine podcast is available. You can go right to the hosting platform, which is edtechexamine.castos.com. And from there, you can link to our information. You can also help us out by subscribing to our Patreon at patreon.com/edtechexamined. Kris, did you want to tell folks how they can contact you?
Yeah, so you can find me. My website is Kris with a K, so KRISHANS.ca, and you'll find my social media handles there as well.
Yeah, and I'm very similar. So you can find everything about me, social media links, etc., at erikchristiansen.net. That's ErikChristiansen.net, and everything else links to there. My tech blog, social links to this podcast episodes, etc.
All right, awesome.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Kris. Take care.
You too.